everyone. Welcome to Rewildology, the show that explores conservation, travel, and rewilding the planet. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell Norman, conservation biologist and adventure traveler. I'm sure if you're listening to this podcast that you're particularly fond of wildlife and wild places. I myself track animals on the weekends in the Rockies and visit as many biodiversity rich countries as my schedule and wallet allow. But as I've gone along my journey, and I'm sure many of you have had this same realization, conservation isn't about nature, it's about people. We all know how difficult people can be to work with. Let's be honest, that's why a lot of us went into nature careers in the first place. However, having a passion for nature isn't enough anymore. We must learn how to work with people. So, what do good old conservationists like us do when we want to foster long term change in communities for the betterment of nature? Today, we are going to learn just that. In this episode, I'm chatting with Kayla Cranston, PhD, Director of Conservation Psychology, Strategy, and Integration at Antioch University, New England. Kayla is a master at creating long term conservation engagement using psychology. She shares so many of her discoveries, the tools she uses when developing conservation strategies in communities, and so much more. If you're working on your master's, PhD, or are at a conservation organization, you cannot miss this episode. Kayla might give you a nugget that could completely change the trajectory of your work. Be sure to listen until the end of the episode to hear this week's question. Feel free to chat about your thoughts on Instagram at Rewildology or in the Rewildologist Facebook group. All right, friends, on to my conversation with Kayla. Well, thank you, Kayla, so much for coming on Rewildology today. Cannot wait to dive deep into your story. But first, before we get to today and all
Mhm.
of the amazing stuff that you're doing and pioneering through, you have an unbelievably amazing resume. Like, I looked at it, girl, it is great. But but obviously, you didn't get to today out of nowhere. So let's go back in time. What was your childhood like? What were some of the big life events that happened to bring you to what you're doing?
Yeah, that's a good question, Brooke. One I've not been asked many places before, so thank you for asking. So I can say that I grew up kind of regular white bread America. I'm a white girl from Arizona, like just kind of your normal middle class family type in the United States. And in that situation, I mean, I had a little bit of a rough childhood, and so I remember thinking as I was growing up, what's really predictable? Animal behavior. And so I fell in love with animals because they were honestly easily, their behavior was very easy to predict. And it's so interesting the way that it turned out that I now am studying human behavior.
It's
But
like your
it
life has come
started,
full circle.
yeah, because it started with my love for animals. I mean, dogs, I would train when I was a kid, just for fun. And chickens, we had chickens, so I'd watch them, and just in general, animal behavior. And as I grew older, that kind of interest turned more into a passion to protect them. I also noticed that sometimes animals don't have voices, and so sometimes they're treated in ways that are not ideal, and I wanted to help save the animals, right? Like that was the main goal. I think probably in high school. And then in high school I was wildly lucky. I did go to public school, but I had this amazing science teacher named Mr. Eberly who was just so fantastic, and he offered us opportunities to travel abroad with him and his wife, who was also a teacher, to go to different conservation sites. One in Australia I went to when I was in high school, one in Hawaii, one in California, like a couple of different places with him as our biology teacher, right? Like he was teaching us something that he called conservation biology, which I didn't know existed at the time. And it was all about saving animals. And I was super stoked about that. And so I started learning about conservation and what it meant and how it was aligned with my interest in saving animals early on. And he is the one that introduced me to Jane Goodall. And she became my idol almost immediately, as many, I'm sure, of your audience members might have as white women growing up who want to be environmentalists in the future. Jane Goodall's this huge influence, right? And so I kind of looked at what she was doing and saw kind of international conservation as something that was like the prime example of what I wanted to do, because that was the type of conservation that I was introduced to early on, not domestic conservation, like abroad. Like the wildlife is over there and we have to go over
Mm.
there to protect it, right? Like that is my white middle class upbringing. Like that is what you're taught here, right? In
Yes,
biology.
actually.
It's so true. It's so
Mhm.
true. And so that is kind of where it all began for me. And then college went on from there. I can tell you that story, or we can stop.
No, no,
Okay.
absolutely, absolutely. And you don't have to answer this question at all, but maybe just to help us put more pieces together, would
Mhm.
you mind or be comfortable sharing some of the things that happened in your childhood that pushed you to go more towards animals than maybe people?
Yeah, humans were in my life not exactly the stable type. Let's just put it that way. And it was one of those things where I think as a kid growing up in that kind of situation, trying to look for anything that was stable was a necessity for survival. And
Mm.
so, as a necessity for survival, I became really close with animals. I ended up liking hanging out with them way more than humans, right? They were predictable. That is what I remember feeling most safe with is, animals. They were predictable and they were great external. I guess the way that I see it now is as kind of external. I don't know what the word is. I suppose they're comfort, right? Comfort animals, kind of. So pets, things like dogs and cats and bunnies and chickens, even. But they are really steady. At least they were when I was a kid, and so I relied on that to kind of get me through a less than ideal childhood
Mm.
at home life, right?
Yeah.
And moving forward, just having the want to save the animals, and then of course full circle coming back to what that meant for perhaps people not like me, but maybe in similar situations where they felt a little less a little more disenfranchised. I mean, I wouldn't have used that word as a kid, but disempowered, and what this world can do for people that feel that way at the same time as saving animals or conserving wildlife, right? Like, so how can we do both is really where I ended up. And it came from the beginning of me needing to be secure and safe, and seeing the animals as a resource for that.
Wow. So everything really did come full circle. But
Yeah.
we're not even two today yet. So okay, so we had these amazing study abroad experiences with this teacher that showed you what conservation biology was. So
Mhm.
I would imagine then the next organic step would be for college to probably go into something similar. So what was the next step in your journey for you?
So the next step in the journey for me really was moving into college at Arizona State University. Got a scholarship on my way. Here I go. And I became a conservation biology major. And Brooke, it turns out that in conservation biology, you have to be super good at chemistry, which I could not pass for the life of me. Like I wanted so hard to be a scientist, a natural scientist, whatever, physical scientist. Could not hack it. God bless those who can. But you know what I really was good at, and probably because of my early experience with an unstable family, I was really good at reading human behavior. Like it just was
Mm.
something that I was naturally inclined to do. And so I found myself after quite a lot of turmoil ending up as a psychology major. And at the time, it felt as though I was taking a cop out. it felt as though I was giving up my dream of really helping to save wildlife, right? Like that to at the time did. And I will tell you that that couldn't be farther from what the truth ended up being. It was a detour that ended up being exactly what I needed. And so during that time, while I was doing the psychology, I also wanted to keep that passion alive for conservation of wildlife. And so in my sophomore year, oh my God, I think it was 19. Goodness gracious. I can't remember what year that was, but I was 19 years old and I went on a trip. You know those companies that do like volunteer, it's almost like, what do you call it? Voluntourism?
Yeah, volunteerism.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, so there were companies that would come to the college and like present to students as like this is a thing you can do. And I saw it at the time as no different than the awesome trips that my teacher in high school took us on, right? And so I was like, I want to do that again. Let's continue doing that. It's been a while since I've been focused on conservation. So I signed up for this unbeknownst to me, a little colonialistic approach to conservation internationally, and basically the kind of outline was right that you white Americans will sign up and spend thousands of dollars on a trip that will take you to a foreign country where you will do a homestay for 2 weeks with a community that you're whose behavior you're essentially trying to change for conservation, for the sake of conservation of something. And in this case, it was sea turtle conservation in Costa Rica, specifically an area called Gandoca, which is right near Panama. It's this whole thing. So it's a beautiful black sand beach. And
Mhm.
the idea is that you go for 2 weeks to do the work and then you do 2 weeks of tourism on top of that, right? So I went for the first 2 weeks, and in a and so we were there, and our job was literally as 19-year-old white people was to go into this community of people who had been around for centuries, right? Like just have been there forever and have lived a subsistence lifestyle off of harvesting sea turtle eggs and whatnot. Well, all of a sudden, right, these sea turtles are becoming less and less frequent, endangered, and mm, may or may not have anything to do with the actual behavior of the people that live there. Has more to do with things like climate change and really horrible things that are going on in our world that have nothing to do with the subsistence lifestyle of the people that lived in Gandoka. However, guess what our job was? Our job, I shit you not, was to patrol the black sand beaches 24 hours a day for poachers that were from the community. So we were legit staying in the homes of the people who we were trying to protect the sea turtles from. Does that just sound like a bad, like a recipe for disaster to you?
Is
Because
that
it
project even
was.
still I mean, how long
I
did that
don't.
project even last? Like, before
I
people
don't.
rebelled?
I don't. I mean, the thing is that they do rebel, right? They do, but they do it in ways, and this is what I learned later, that are not obviously the ways that perhaps us Americans would rebel, right? So instead of standing up and saying, "Get the hell out of my community," what did they do? They, and by they I mean some one or two individuals in their community, they stole all of my stuff, and it wasn't just me. Like it was a large number of us, and so I ended up in the unfortunate situation of being in this small town in the middle of nowhere, Gandoka, Costa Rica, with no passport, no credit cards, no anything, like nothing. Like they took everything. And I was 19 and stupid, right? So I didn't know how to travel internationally with like watching my back. Like that wasn't a thing. And they know that. So so instead of protesting, they took the company's money, and then of course the one of the ways that historically disenfranchised people really stand up for themselves is by dragging their feet or protesting in some way that is perhaps less obvious to um, uh, you know traditionally American ways of standing up for yourself. They get it done though. And I'll tell you what stopped the minute that happened, the Black Sand Beach Patrol. That's what stopped because they had to come in, do an audit. It was a whole thing, right? So there I am in Gandoka, visiting the embassy every day for the rest of the month that I was there because I couldn't go back home without a passport. And I had a lot of time to think about what had happened and a lot of time to get really angry at things that my 19-year-old brain couldn't fully wrap itself around. That I later found out, oh no. Like, I'm just glad at this point that all that happened was that my passport and credit cards were stolen, right? Because of the magnitude of the audacity that myself and my fellow travelers had to come into to a community like that and say, you're the problem, yours is the behavior that needs to change, not anyone else's, not ours, for God's sakes, right? So that kind of got me thinking about this international conservation thing in a different light. And I remember being on a high horse coming home once I finally got home. Of I'm just so glad that we as Americans aren't like that, right? That we don't
Mm.
slaughter whatever it is. And I remember thinking to like, you got to be kidding me. Like later on, looking back on how I felt about the situation, as of course I'm driving home from the airport and they're like Hummers like going by, and I'm in the middle of a ridiculous city that spends way too much on aquaculture. But regardless, it's it was a moment for me of just like, well, that didn't work out. Why? And it was again an unexpected thing, right? Unpredictable behavior. And it just I needed to know why. And
Mm.
so I finished up my bachelor's in psychology, really focusing on behavioral and social psychology. What made people tick? What made people do the things they do? Things like this, right? Like that was my secondary. I wouldn't say it was a passion at the time. At the time, it was just a skill set. I was good at it and I was interested in it. My passion was still conservation. And so in 2009, I believe, when I nope 2007, and I had the opportunity to go and get my master's, I studied um, something called sustainable community development because I
Wow.
started to see that there was a connection between human psychology and environmental conservation. And I knew that it also had to be nested in community. And I wanted to know, how do you do it better? Right? I had just experienced this whole thing in college about how to do it the wrong way.
Wrong.
Wrong, wrong, wrong in so many
Super
ways.
wrong.
It is super wrong. And instead of writing a thesis on why it was so wrong, instead I wanted to find a way to create a plan to develop a sustainable community. Like, how would you do that? And I found out a lot, but the way that I did it was applying my psychological background, principles of social and behavioral psychology, to the development of a sustainable community. Um, yeah, a plan for the development of a sustainable community. And I was very proud of myself, Brooke. I thought
Good.
I had I shit you not. I thought, God, I was so cute. I thought I had created a whole ass field. Brooke. I really did. I was like, oh my God, I don't know what this is called, but I've just created it and I'm brilliant and yada yada. Then I Googled, and it turns out that the term conservation psychology already existed and had for many years, and since 2003, actually, when a woman named Carol Saunders, who was a co-founder of the field, penned an article in Human Ecology that defined what it meant to study these reciprocal relationships between human and nature, with specifically an eye to not just knowing what's going on, right? Like not just understanding that relationship, but a specific eye towards fostering behavior that would support the mission of conservation and specifically biodiversity conservation. And so, oh my God, right? I was blown away. Like, holy crap, I just did like 2 years worth of work in a field I didn't even know existed. This is amazing.
Wow.
And and so in my one-time Google situation, apparently, I found where Carol was, and I found out that she was at Antioch University of New England. She had just moved there from Brookfield Zoo, and she was looking for students. And so that's how I found my doctorate program.
Mm.
at Antioch. And I went
Wow.
there. Yeah, and I went
Oh
there.
my gosh. Oh my gosh. Okay, so sounds like you have now found your dream mentor. You're like
Mhm.
freaking like the sky parted, the sun rays came down on you.
Right.
Conservation psychology is your thing. You've been working in it, you didn't even know it. And here is your amazing mentor. So then what happened from there? So did you email her like, please let me be your student? Like, how did that go? And then what did you end up studying with her?
Right. So the way that it went was, oh God, she was such a humble woman.
Hmm.
So Carol passed a couple of years ago, and since then, and we'll get to this, I've been working to continue her legacy. So it's interesting to think back about the time that I first connected with her. And I remember thinking at the time, and this has been the case for all of my mentors across my entire academic career. I I gravitate towards mentors who are saying what I'm thinking, but in a better dialect. So they're saying it better than I could think it. Right. But it's the same thought. It's just they're saying it way better than I could. Right.
Yeah. Know
They've
that
got the
feeling?
words, right? Like they've got the words that I've got nothing. And but I believe them, and that's how I feel. Like thank God somebody is saying it in the articulate way that they are. And so Carol, for me at that time in my life, was that woman. And I called her. I was an admissions counselor at Prescott College at the time, and I called her and I explained myself. And it turned out that she had a very similar background to mine. She loved animal behavior, had her background in psychology and behavioral biology, and she studied in Africa, right? So I'm like, oh my gosh, it's all happening. I'm gonna be Jane Goodall, right? Really excited. And so she mentioned to me while I was on the phone with her that she just, a year ago had gotten to Antioch, and that she herself was setting up something called a conservation psychology institute at Antioch, and she would love my help. And so that's how I did it. I moved to Keene, New Hampshire to be her right hand person as she and her team there set up the Conservation Psychology Institute. And that was my
Wow.
in. I mean, it wasn't a lot of money that I was getting paid to do it, but just the experience and the development of the relationships that happened out of that have to this day been absolutely invaluable.
Was that one of the best phone calls of your life? I'm just seeing me as
Yeah.
Kayla, like,
Yeah.
I would have been running around in laps like
Yeah.
a freaking poodle, just
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was one of my first of many experiences with people. It felt like serendipity
Mm.
because they needed something at the same time that I did, and our needs and wants kind of collided. And it also was the first time of many times that I would have had since then where people who have every single right to be completely full of themselves because of what they've done for this world are completely humble and just grateful that you're interested in what they're interested in. Like we're all nerds, right? Like let's just nerd out on this. So yeah, it was a great conversation.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we got to go to what's next here.
Mhm.
But before we do, so that we have actual context of what conservation psychology is,
Mhm.
could you define it in your own words and then really go into like what did you end up studying? Like how are you a conservation psychologist? What was your PhD about all of that? So
Mhm.
maybe give us a little bit more background because it is a relatively new thing.
Yeah.
People have heard conservation, but
Mhm.
not necessarily conservation psychology, which I
Right.
love this subject, which is why I'm so glad we're talking. So what is it and what do you study in it?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good question. And I'm going to try to be succinct here because I could go on and on. But the field of conservation psychology, I mean, first of all, you've already had somebody on your podcast, Kathy Cahill, who is an expert in conservation psychology. And I believe the title of that podcast was Human Behavior is the Problem or
The
something like that.
conservation is a people problem.
Yes,
Uh-huh.
conservation is a people problem, right?
Mhm.
Which kind of indicates that's all that it is, right? That we are the problem. Our behavior is the problem, which is so true. That is true, and it's a large part of what conservation psychology is about: is identifying exactly what those behaviors are, so that we can change them. Yada yada, right? The other part of conservation psychology is learning all about how you can make those connections stronger and really motivate humans to do behavior that goes in the opposite direction, right? So that not only are people the problem, but people are also the solution. And if you can get your mind around what we know about human psychology, right? For the last 60, 70 years, we have studied the human mind. There's a lot to know about why we do the things that we do. And if you can take all of that and apply it towards the mission of biodiversity conservation and getting people in line with what is sustainable and harmonious with nature, like why not? Like what a great goal to have with all of that knowledge combined, put it together and put it towards understanding and changing human behavior towards conservation. So that's what conservation psychology is to me in my own words.
But that's the most important. I
Yeah.
want to know what it is because I mean anyone could Google it. What is conservation psychology?
Right,
But it's like, but
right,
what is it to you? No, I
right.
love that. It is. It is both. It's both sides. We
Hmm.
are the problem, but we are also the solution
That's right.
because we have to be.
That's right. That's
Like
right.
we have to be. But okay. So now you're at this university with this amazing new mentor. What did you study for your doctorate? And I'm assuming it was directly in line with this amazing new mentor of yours.
You would think, Brooke. You
Oh.
really would.
Oh, I didn't think. Okay, maybe
Well,
not.
no, I mean, in a lot of ways, it was. She's a pioneer, was a pioneer in her field. Conservation psychology is my jam, always will be, and always has been. And her research, her personal research, was way more in line with Kath Iyun's research on empathy than it was with what I ended up focusing on. And that right there is the marker of an amazing mentor, that they can show you the way, introduce you to the people, and really give you the skills you need to identify what your own passion is and to go after it. And that is exactly what Carol did for me. And I ended up focusing less on empathy and more on long-term behavior change. So what I noticed in the literature was that there was a lot of work around short term or one time behavior change. So things like, I am going to create a sign so that people at this park know how to recycle, like put their recycling in the right bin, right? Like that's important. That's one time behavior change. It's super important. I'm going to create a campaign to get people to, put uh, compact fluorescent, whatever, the new light bulbs in, right? The more energy efficient
The
light
LED
bulbs.
ones, yeah.
Yeah, the LED, I'm going to get people to install LED light bulbs. And that is super important. And there was a lot known about it. And so when I started doing research about international conservation and what the problems were that perhaps psychology could help solve, it became more and more apparent that that one time behavior change was not going to cut it. When it came to overseas or really anywhere, this longer term behavior was required, especially if we were talking about sustainable conservation work that perhaps needed to be done by people who knew the area the best. And this came to fruition in an example or a case study that I focused on many in East Africa. So I actually ended up in Africa for my dissertation.
Nice.
Nice. But instead of Jane Goodalling it, I was studying the Jane Goodalls. I was
Wow.
studying the conservation professionals who lived, worked, and were born and raised in the East African area. So in reality, I was studying the opposite of the Jane Goodalls. I was studying the individuals who didn't come from the UK to study conservation in East Africa. I was working with the individuals who were born and raised in that area. And the question I had was, what was keeping them going? Right? What was keeping them going over time through the many ups and downs that conservation work throws at you? What keeps them going over time? That was my question. What helps build their capacity to continue this work without the Jane Goodalls of the world? So if you think about it, this all started back in the day in college when I went to Gandoka and found out white girls do not belong. It's not that we don't belong, but it is that we don't belong. And
Yes.
we need to know that is, if you're gonna come and parachute in, just know that the reality is you're not going to have much impact, and in fact they will have much more impact on you, and that's what you're paying for. And so there's that, right? And so I ended up working with individuals who are in country who could continue and sustain this work over time. My work was at trying to apply psychology to the development of capacity building interventions. So along the way, conservation organizations, big ones too, all of them, have realized more and more that these more sustained efforts in country are the sweet spot. They are where it's at. You need to engage, empower. This term empowerment kept coming up. You need to empower the individuals in the community, empower the individuals. You know what they didn't talk about? How in God's name you were going to do that. Like, they didn't talk about that at all. And as a psychologist, I was sitting there going, hold on, y'all. There's like literally like 60 years of research on psychological empowerment. Hold on, let me go get a definition. We will operationalize the hell out of it. And then we're going to measure it to see if you're doing it right.
Mm.
That was what my plan was, right? Like, and so I went and I did a lot of participatory research in East Africa to identify whether or not my plan was correct. And it turns out not so much. Psychology and psychological empowerment were important, but the continuation of that behavior over time didn't come from just feeling empowered, this self efficacy. I can do this. No, 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 no. It required, as I'm sure you can imagine, much more complex emotions and much more complex situations to carry on over time. And so that's what I ended up studying. That's what I ended up focusing on, was what were those indicators of long-term engagement and conservation. What was it that was going to build the long-term capacity for sustained engagement in conservation behavior?
So is this the basis of your 5 factors of sustained engagement? Is that
Oh
where this
yeah.
came from?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, so
Yeah.
what are those? What did you
Do you
let
want
us
me
know?
to?
What
Right,
are they?
we buried the lead, didn't we? Right. So, as I mentioned, a lot of the literature at the time was talking a lot about empowerment, but not talking a lot about what that meant or how to get there, in any operationalized form. And a lot of it was very much like, well, it's this nebulous thing, and wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be nice? And my experience was that it wouldn't just be, it's absolutely essential. It's not a wouldn't it be nice if these folks were empowered to do this work over time by themselves. It's a, you ain't got no other choice. Like, it's like, stop it. Like, that's the long-term success of biodiversity conservation here and abroad really is focused on the people who live there being able to continue that work over time without outside influence, you know, things like this. And so that is kind of where we, that's where I focused. And so those 5 factors came out of me digging into the psychological literature, pulling out definitions, putting that stuff together in a survey, giving it to a bunch of East African conservation professionals, and then analyzing the hell out of the data until I could pull themes that actually connected, right? The indicators that predicted whether or not these professionals continued on in the career over time, continued
Mm.
on to apply skills that they learned to conservation over time, right? 10, 20, 15 years out, that was my horizon that I was looking at. And so the 5 factors that we found out were what I am now calling the 5 factors of sustained engagement. Um, the way I've explained it in the past is as an internal carrot. I think the reason I explain it like that is because for decades, conservation organizations have attempted to motivate human behavior with what could be considered the carrot or the stick method. And so the carrot method is, here's your reward for doing conservation behavior. And while that sometimes it does often work for one time behaviors or short-term behaviors like recycling or screwing in a light bulb, it is less effective for the longer term engagement that is necessary for biodiversity conservation in the long run, right? Sustained engagement. And so the other side of that is the stick method, which is regulations, right? We are going to regulate the hell out of you if you don't do this. If you don't do this, it's punishment. It's if you don't do this, then this will happen, right? Or at best, it's negative reinforcement, which we can talk about later. But regardless, it doesn't work for long-term behavior change. It just doesn't work. And so there's tons of literature out there about how to really foster this shorter term behavior, but I was focused on the factors that really predicted this longer term. And so those factors I ended up calling in the beginning the internal carrot, because it was the thing that got people out of bed in the morning, right? The thing that gets you up, gets you going, super excited. You have your own internal carrot, Brooke. I know you do. Everybody does. And the question is, what does that look like for professionals in the conservation field to continue over time, or people who are working towards the mission of conservation in some way or another? And those five factors include things like meaningful ownership, right? Effective autonomy, group efficacy, community demand, and something called self regulated understanding. And I can explain each of those if you'd like, but those are the five factors.
Yeah, let's go into them. I feel like I'm just like prying open a gold mine of knowledge right now, and I'm just, oh, teach me your ways, Kayla. What are these things?
Okay, so here's what I learned. Meaningful ownership and effective autonomy are two that, if you are a seasoned professional, these things are going to come just easy. You're going to understand them. If you work with humans at all, you will understand why this works. Okay. The first two indicators of long term behavior towards conservation are meaningful ownership and effective autonomy. Meaningful ownership, we'll take them one by one. Is meaningful ownership is the feeling of whatever you're asking me to do, whether it's come to the table for a shared decision making process over marine protected areas in Oregon, or it's really asking me to do a certain behavior over time, engage in conservation action myself over time. Whatever it is you're asking me to do is either personally or professionally meaningful to me. Okay? These are the reasons why we have extension agents at some of these land grant universities. I mean, they are the ones who know what is personally and professionally meaningful to the people on the ground, right? Which is whose behavior we're largely aiming to change, so, or to foster over time. And so that's meaningful ownership, is whether or not the action you're asking them to do is personally or professionally meaningful to them. And that can change. What I found that can change over time. That can change over time, of course, but it can also change based on the culture that you're in, right?
Hmm.
So what's
Oh,
personally and professionally meaningful to East Africans perhaps might not be the same thing that is personally or professionally meaningful to Americans, North Americans, right? And that's a pretty easy concept to get on board
yeah.
with. So the trick here, right, the strategy to foster meaningful ownership really is finding out early what it is about your audience that gets them excited. What is it that is priority for them, either professionally or personally? Okay, that is the trick. That is how you foster that aspect of the five factors. Um, and like I said, a lot of seasoned professionals get that. Like, they don't need a psychologist to come and tell them that they should probably make what they're doing important to the people that they're asking to engage. They don't need me to tell them that. Same goes with the second one. The second one is called effective autonomy, and it's essentially the feeling of I've got this. Like, I don't need an expert over my shoulder to tell me what to do. As you can imagine, you're learning something technical skill, or you're learning something about a new way of doing things. You don't want to have a compost expert over your shoulder every single second telling you what to do. You want to be able to feel some type of autonomy in your ability to do that thing. And so if you can foster effective autonomy in your participants or the people that you're working with, that will likely lead to this longer term engagement. So these two, meaningful ownership and effective autonomy, one of the best strategies to increase effective autonomy is to continually ask people and check in with them about where they're at. right? To really, and the way that we do this in trainings is by doing this thing called positive change, where at the end of every day of the training, whatever it is, we ask them to identify one thing they really liked about what happened that day and one thing that they would like to change for the next day. And so it allows them to identify their level of understanding, what their barriers are in the moment, so that the facilitators of whatever's happening, the decision making process or the training, can really calibrate in the moment what these folks need to know to not feel like they need an expert over their shoulder every single step of the way. So you get it early, you get it during the training, right? Or during the decision making process. So meaningful ownership, effective autonomy. Those are two a lot of people just get off the bat. These last three are not as easy to understand, and a lot of people get them wrong. And I'll start with the first one that a lot of conservation professionals traditionally have gotten wrong. This one is called community demand, and it is essentially the idea of our community is in need of. Our community is now better because of the work that you're asking me to do, right? And it's specific because it asks the person who's the indicator is basically the feeling of, not just do I feel it, but my neighbors have come to me and told me, thank you so much for doing what it is that you're doing. It is a huge part of the success of our community, the well-being of our community. That is a high bar, Brooke. It's a really high bar. And you know what it's not? It is the opposite of a conservation professional identifying what they think is necessary in a community. So that's the important piece that a lot of conservation professionals get wrong. They hear something like community demand or community need or whatever it is, and they assume, well, I know what these folks need. Somehow, sometimes the community doesn't even know what they need, right? Like, God
Okay.
forbid. I know, right? Flip a table, right? Okay, so I mean, this is what gets white girls, passports stolen, like this kind of shit. So don't do that. Realize that what we're talking about is the type of demand that comes from neighbors talking to neighbors, colleagues talking to colleagues, saying, you know what, we actually really need you to go do. We need you to do this thing. And yeah, sure, it's in line with conservation, or maybe it's not, or whatever it is. The idea is community demand needs to be identified by the community itself, not by you. Not by you as a professional. It needs to be identified by the actual people that are in the community that whose behavior you're aiming to change. So that's community demand, and that's one, like, whatever, 3/5 of the equation. The other two are quite simple. And we can talk about the strategies that increase community demand the most, but I will just start by saying, like, we can go into this later, but the truth is that the strategies that foster community demand the most is by, this is going to sound simple, asking asking the
Polling.
community asking the community what it is that they want to learn about, what it is that they want to do that is in line with their community goals themselves. And then you find the sweet spot of what overlaps with conservation goals and their community goals, and you do that, whatever that is. So there's a lot of different ways to go about doing that, depending on how well you know the community, and we can talk about that in a bit if you'd like. But we'll just go briefly over what these other two last ones are. So
Yes.
the last one's group efficacy is one of the last ones, and it is the feeling. And I know everybody gets the opposite of this all of the time. When you are on a team with people, maybe in school, maybe not, where you're like, I feel effective. I'm doing my job, but this guy can't pull his shit together and is
Yep.
ruining everything, right? Doesn't have to be a guy, usually is. Doesn't have to be a guy. And so that is the opposite of group efficacy. What we
Mm.
want to feel is that we are effective as a group. And the best way to do this is to show people that what their input is, that whatever they're giving you, right? Whether it's behavior, whether it's input, whether it's decision making, whatever it is, that is in an important way changing the trajectory of the project. So the biggest way to burn people out is to ask them to just keep giving you information, giving you information, giving you information, and then you never tell them where that information goes, how it's being used. If it's being used, they are left to wonder, um, what's going on with that survey data, Kayla? What's going on? That's the quickest way to reduce group efficacy. So you want to do the opposite of that, showing folks if they give you information and input whatever it is, show them how it's being used to really direct the trajectory of the project. So that's group efficacy. The final one, and really the coolest one, is called self-regulated understanding. So for decades, we as conservationists have believed that to build the capacity of individuals in country to do biodiversity conservation, you need to teach them two things: skills and leadership. Skills and leadership. Skills and leadership, right? So knowledge based, right? If they only knew what to do, Brooke, they would do it, right? If they only knew what I knew, they would do what I do. Oh, Lord. So that's so wrong. But that's the basis of conservation psychology, is acknowledging that it's not just a knowledge gap that is the problem, that there is so much more to it. And so that is why this is only one of 5 factors of sustained engagement. Self regulated understanding says the type of knowledge that you need to be able to continue to do something over time by yourself, not like a charismatic leader there to like cajole you to do it, not hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of funding, just you to continue to do it over time. You need the type of knowledge where you can identify and then subsequently correct any mistakes that you make while you're doing it. So if there is a project that you're working on and you're being taught a specific skill to be a part of that project over time, you want to be able to identify if you've made a mistake in the process and then be able to correct it. And so, and the same goes for decision making process. If you've made a mistake, you offended somebody, you know how to identify that, pull it back, and really fix it, right, yourself. And so, if you can do that, then you can do whatever it is, the decision making process or the application of skill over time, likely more than you could otherwise if you didn't have that level of understanding. And so, the best way to foster self regulated understanding is by allowing for those opportunities to catch your own mistakes in the moment, when you're being taught the thing or when you're being introduced to the process. So setting it up so that you really are role playing. What does this look like in the real world? And you find out real quick if you've got it or if you don't. Creative, engagement processes like role playing or really having an accountability partner with each other, right? Coming to trainings in more than just yourself, but with somebody next to you who can be your accountability partner for continuing that behavior over time really helps with increased self-regulated understanding. So that's it. Those are 5. Those are the 5.
Wow.
Mhm.
Those are amazing 5. I just felt like I learned so much. So now, okay, now we have all this knowledge. We have these 5 amazing engagement tools now. We now have them. How do we apply them? Let's say that somebody is listening to this right now. Maybe they're getting ready to start their PhD. Maybe they work for a nonprofit and they want to do more in community engagement in wherever this area is that they work.
Mhm.
And they're like, Kayla, I hear you. That was amazing. How in the world do they take this knowledge now and apply it so that they're making real conservation change?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I will say that the answer is get yourself a social scientist. I'm not lying. I
Mm.
mean, that is the answer. The reality is we have gone forwards and backwards on trying to figure out the best way to integrate psychological principles into the, and apply them to conservation for, my goodness, decades now. And I can tell you from personal experience that it's not always easy. It's not ever easy. And it's sure the hell isn't going to be easy for folks, probably like some of the folks in your audience who were not trained in social science, not trained as psychologists. and just are interested. They want to do it, but hell, man, they don't want to go get a PhD or the doctorate, or the master's. If you do, Antioch University has a great one in conservation psychology. But if you're not,
Plug.
just saying. But if you're not, you can do short-term trainings. You can attempt to do that, but in the long run, you have to ask yourself the return on investment. If you have a social scientist who knows what they're doing on your team, or you can build the capacity of somebody who has that interest that's already on your team to be that expert for you, you're golden, right? And the idea would be not to try to make every single person on your team a social science expert, because that is not a thing. But if you want to build your own capacity to do it, and be kind of like, the person in your company or whatever it is, your organization, to be this person, you could go get your doctorate, you could go get your master's in it, both of which are offered at Antioch University and other places in conservation psychology. You could also just hire somebody to be on your team that already has that information, already has that education. And there's also coaching services that are out there. So in case you're somewhere in between, right? Like, you don't want to go get a doctorate or a master's in it, but you sure as hell don't want to have to continue to hire consultants again and again and again and again, project after project. There's this middle ground, and it's called coaching. And it's actually based on the model that we use at Antioch is based on my dissertation. 5 factors is what keeps people going over time. So there is a model by which you can build your own capacity to apply psychology to conservation, and we use it and study it at Antioch. That's one way of doing it.
And
So
if
that's how.
somebody wants to go through that coaching program,
Mhm.
should they contact you? Is it a website? What exactly is it?
Yeah. So definitely can contact me. I am at Cranston at antioch.edu. Email me. I love a good conversation. So that's definitely one. The other way to go would be to just Google Conservation Psychology Institute. And that will land you at Antioch University's page, talking about conservation psychology and everything we have to offer. We do have free webinars, a free webinar series, in case you want to just get your beak wet on what this is. You want more of this, you can probably get it for free. Well, you can get it for free, for the webinars that we run out of the Conservation Psychology Institute. But if you want to dive deeper, then you have your option of going for the big degree, getting a consultant, or doing some coaching.
Mm. Oh my gosh, yeah, I'm gonna definitely be looking into those resources for sure.
Okay.
Because it wasn't even until my master's and talking to
Yeah.
one of the advisors of the program that I had even heard about this. Because coming from a very, like, the exact opposite,
Mm.
very strong science background,
Yeah.
where like human emotions, don't even think about it because we need science.
Right.
We
Right.
need science. And then going into the field, I'm like, so everything I learned was relevant, but not applicable
Mm.
because who cares if I understand exactly how this one species of something evolved or like
Yeah.
why this adaptation came to be? Does it actually matter in the big realm of things? Not really, because that doesn't
Yeah.
because it's going to disappear very soon. So, it
Right.
doesn't matter if I understand how it works biologically. So,
Right.
I love this concept, and that's why I'm so glad to sit down and chat with you about it because I have way more to learn myself. But I'm a scientist, and so that is why I need to learn more about this too, and why I recommend anybody else listening, especially if you want to make a different, or maybe your project's stalling, and you're like, I have no
Mm.
fucking idea what to do now.
That is
Like, what is going
usually
on?
what brings people to us, and what
Mm.
sells it for them. The idea of applying conservation psychology is because most of them are like you, Brooke. They are trained as physical or biological scientists, and or zoologists, or some kind of ology that is, science based, scientific method. And they see conservation psychology for what it is. It is the scientific study of human behavior, just like conservation biology is the scientific study of animal behavior in the realm of like how to go towards the mission of conservation. Same thing. That's how you can look at it. And so when we frame it like that, scientists become all of a sudden very okay with what we're doing because
It
scientific
clicks.
method, right? Because scientific method, we're not making shit up. We got graphs and shit. You know what I mean? Like we don't have to. We're
It,
using
it's
we're
real.
using we're using the same methods. We believe in post positivism. Sorry, we believe in science. Like it's a thing. So that is that's I think what gets at least the higher ups in these organizations that I'm working with on board is that they are scientists, and they understand the importance of following a very strategic and intentional approach to studying these things and really engaging and implementing evidence based strategies. Like that is their game, right? Like you don't go about trying to conserve endangered species without evidence-based strategies. You also don't go about trying to change the behavior of humans without evidence-based strategies. You just don't, right? Like that's usually the sell.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh my gosh, yeah. And like I'm so sold. I'm so on board. And I hope that anybody else, like, if you're to that point, this probably is the way to
Yeah.
look next. Or if you haven't even started, look into this too.
Yeah.
Like as you're designing whatever project it is that you are working on. Like definitely, yeah, definitely
Yeah.
look into this. It's awesome. So the next thing I would really love to chat about, and just having traveled around the world a lot and also knowing a lot of people that have traveled to do PhDs in different cultures that are not their own. I would love to ask you this question. Answer it how you would like. So like how do conservationists foster behavior change in cultures that are not their own? And should these methods change if they are in their own culture? What
Yeah.
do you think about that?
It's such a good question, Brooke. And I'll say my answer to this is that of course something that you might just gather from your own personal experiences that of course conservationists who are interested in fostering behavior change in a culture that is not their own will likely need to employ different methods, right? Than they would if they were attempting to foster behavior change in their own culture. So what those methods are largely is dependent on the culture, but perhaps not in the way that you might assume. So there are some universals across culture, right? Psychologists love universals. We love things to be the same across cultures. Gotta love a psychologist. And there are some universals across the culture, and that's where the 5 factors of sustained engagement come into play. And I'm an evaluator, right? So I, by training, and so I focus on the goals of your program first before we suggest methods. And so, if, for instance, long term motivation to perform a behavior iteratively or over a time, like composting at home or coming to the table many times over a course of a 3-year co design project, is your goal, like if that is your goal, that long term behavior, you need to aim for the 5 factors. And the good news is that the 5 factors are universal across cultures. My research focused
Mm.
on a group in East Africa, North America, England. What they mean is universal, but how they show up in behavior and how they can be fostered does change based on culture. So, an example, if I want to foster, for instance, community demand, right, which is one of the most important 5 factors of sustained engagement, in my fellow staff, say I'm at an organization, right, and I want to foster this community demand in my fellow staff because they need to help me continue this project over time too. It's not just me. I can't do it by myself, right? So I need to foster these 5 factors in my fellow staff at the conservation organization, community demand being one of them. I may already know just from my own personal experience as one of these staff members what would make the project useful or relevant to the staff, right? So you can measure this aspect by asking your fellow staff, like, how have how has this project been important to the well-being of the organization, or has it, or will it, like how will this project, whatever I'm asking them to do, be super duper important to either the community as a whole or the organization's mission. So essentially you go with what you've heard from people like you, right? You go with what you've heard from people like you along the way. So it's essentially the same approach with other cultures or populations, but instead you have to listen a little differently. So whereas in the previous example where they're very much like you, maybe they're white girls from Arizona too, don't have to be from Arizona, but maybe they're, people like you and me, Brooke, right? And if that's the case and you spend time with them long enough, you probably can listen in a myriad of ways. However, when it's different culture, different population, you really have to listen differently and more intentionally in ways that you've never had to before, likely. And so, what I mean by that is when I started working with a conservation organization in 2017, 18, and they asked me, okay, well, we're going to go into a community in Ferguson, Missouri, and we want you to tell us what is going to make our programming relevant and useful to the people in Ferguson, Missouri. First move, identify that you are a white girl from Arizona or whatever you are. If you are not from Ferguson, Missouri, and somebody's asking you to help them make their programming relevant to people in Ferguson, Missouri, you need to go to Ferguson, Missouri, and you need to ask the people that live there and have been born and raised in that area to help you with that. However, there are a lot of different ways that this can go wrong and has gone wrong in the long term so many times, right?
So many.
Conservation, so many times. Conservation organizations are quite literally notorious for coming in and out of communities, historically disenfranchised communities, asking for input, taking that input, and then getting the heck out of there. So there is a very specific strategy called co-design that you can use to really help develop that community demand as well as the other four factors of sustained engagement that has been proven by science to work. And you should use that, and it's going to take a long time, especially if your institution has not had very much success in the past engaging that population. So if you don't have a history of knowing how to talk or listen to this population, you need to do a co-design process, and it's going to take time, energy, resources. The good news is there's a heck of a lot of funding out there right now for it. So keep that in mind. But that's what I would suggest about methods in your own culture and then outside of your culture.
So what did you do when you got to Ferguson, Missouri?
Oh, sorry, am I bearing the lead again? So I mean, it was a 3-year process, and it's the same process that I'm implementing at the 4 zoos that I'm working with now across the United States. But it's a 3-year process where you're essentially starting by asking what assets already exist in the community. I think this is where we go wrong a lot, is when we as conservation organizations come into a community and ask, what do you need? What do you lack? Where's the gap? Like it's horrible, right? Like don't do that, especially in a community that has been historically disenfranchised. The quickest way to shut down communication is by asking them where the gap is. Like just don't do that. That's
So
not a good idea.
insulting.
That's so insulting. And it's so like, imagine somebody coming to your back door and going, what do you lack? Like, no, stop it. No. So anyway, don't do that. Come at it from an asset based approach, which is the opposite of a deficit based approach, which basically says, we know y'all got it. Like to a certain extent, you don't need a damn zoo. You don't need a giraffe in your life. Like you really don't. You can handle things on your own. And we would like to be your neighbors. We would like to be a useful, relevant part of this community, just like you. What's already working well in your community? Where do you want to be in 5 to 10 years in your community goals? And how can we, once you've identified where they're at, point A, where they want to be, point B, how can we work together to get from point A to point B? That takes a year, Brooke. It did take a year in Ferguson because of all of that. And in the meanwhile, one of the most essential pieces is hiring staff to be at our table every single day, full time, 4 of them, in fact, from the community that we were attempting to engage. So people who are
Mm.
born and raised in the Ferguson area. to show us, to help us, to guide us, to figure out how to listen to their fellow community members. Because we sure the hell didn't know, even though the institution was very well known. Um, it was not seen as something that was relevant. At least the educational program was not seen as something that was relevant to lower income areas, lower income populations. So that's what we did. We started the co-design process, which began with a year of listening, essentially, and moved into a second year of strategic development of programming with the partners that we developed relationships with in the first year. And then the third phase is about pilot testing. So not assuming you get it right and identifying what the indicators that the community has helped you focus on, have set for you, the standards that the community has set for you, and holding your programming up to those standards and reflecting back to the community, this is what we found, this is what you said you wanted, this is what we did, this is what we found, and how it affected these indicators you said were important. What do you want us to do? If there are scientists in the audience, this is very similar to an adaptive management approach. And you infiltrate the five factors into that. You infuse the five factors into that management approach, and that's how you get co-design. And so, if anybody's interested, let me know because I could talk for decades about this approach.
Oh my gosh, that sounds amazing. That sounds amazing. I feel like we need to have like a whole series with Kayla. Like series with Kayla. Phase 1 or episode 1.
Episode
Here's
one.
this and we can go from there. We can go from there. But
Right.
yeah. So how did you and Kathleen meet?
Oh God, you're gonna love this story. Well, she's gonna love this story because I don't. So this is a stress interesting. So Cathayun and I, how did we meet first? I I was just entering the zoo world officially. So ready to get my doctorate. Carol introduces me to all these zoo professionals. And then I go do a postdoc at Oregon State University working on burnout in fishermen who are asked to be in long-term decision-making processes with marine protected areas. And and then of course Trump comes along. And all of our funding was completely out, gone because EPA was gone. And so my boss at postdoc looked at me and said, "Could you get a job like maybe somewhere else?" And so I did. I used the connections I had through Carol to get a job at the St. Louis Zoo. And while I was there, I was conservation education researcher. My job was to make darn sure that the education programs that they had there at the zoo were having the the impact that they said they wanted to have on the participants in those education programs. Specifically, what brought me to Kathayun was I was working on a nature preschool project. So our zoo had a huge nature preschool program that was filled with, yes, mostly higher income white kids, I'll be honest, but it was a great laboratory for what increases certain behaviors in that young of an age, right? Preschoolers. And so the buzzword around the zoo world right now is empathy. Empathy this, empathy that, right? We've got to increase empathy. God forbid we don't have empathy. So we're going to create empathy. That's what's happening. And so I was tasked with determining whether or not, or to what degree, the nature preschool was increasing empathy and moral reasoning in preschoolers. So that was my dream job. I'm like, I'm a psychologist. Let me go study the hell out of children. And so that's what we did. And in doing so, I was pushed towards Kathayun's work on empathy. And she had, a couple of years prior, worked with this group of zoos in the Pacific Northwest to create a toolkit of how to increase empathy in the zoo setting, and then subsequently how to measure that change, which is what I was interested in,
Mm.
right? And so I did what any good scientist would do. I dug into her literature, I pulled the instrument, I started trying to use it, and it did not work. It was not working. And I kind of knew why. Um, because it was not intended for preschoolers. But what
Mm.
that led to was a conversation with Kathayun where God bless her. I swear to God, our first conversation was me like drilling her on like the science. Like, I don't even know what it was. It was like, tell me about the factor analysis that you went through to get to this. Cause I'm a, I'm a psychometrician, right? I'm like, tell me the details. How did you do this? What does this, and how are you, and what, and why doesn't it work with, whatever. So that's how I met Kathleen, and she was gracious enough to have that conversation with me. And and then later, I found out that my advisor, the day before she passed, actually made a couple of phone calls, two of which were to one was to me, and one was to Kathleen. So remember, I told you Carol's area of interest in research with it was empathy. So Katha Yoon's the up and coming expert on empathy in the world of conservation. She just is. And Carol knew that. And she wanted to support Katha Yoon's continued work, continued scholarship, and continued application of that work in the zoo world. And so when Carol called me the day before she passed, God bless her, she, what a rock star, right? You're on your deathbed and you're like, I'm now going to call people to make sure that the legacy of my field continues after I'm gone. And that
Wow.
is exactly what happened. And she called me and said, I need you to get together with Kath Ayoun and Johnny Fraser, another one of her mentees, and I need you all to move it forward, move the field forward. And so all of a sudden, Kath Ayoun and I got much closer because we were like one of three, two of three that had gotten that specific phone call. And so that's exactly kind of what leads us to where I am now. And now Kath Ayoun is research faculty at Antioch University, New England, which is really exciting. So we get to work together even more closely now.
Well, let's go into that. So,
Okay.
okay. So, Carol, very sadly, I hope she's resting, watching you guys and be like, "Oh my God, you're amazing!"
Right.
But so she has passed on. So there's this big hole that's left in Conservation Psychology Institute. So what happens from there? You're still a part of the organization. Have you taken on those big shoes? And Kathy Yoon has now come over. So what
Mhm.
do you do now? And also, what does Kathy Yoon do?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, and I said it most succinctly, I think when we were just starting to really shape the idea of what this would look like. And I'll say it again, which is that the most effective way that we can really honor Carol's legacy is to acknowledge early and often that there is no damn way one of us could continue this by ourselves over time. There's just no way. She was too dynamic. She knew herself the importance of the network of individuals who were doing this work. Because as bright as Kath Ayoun is, and as great as our research might be here, we are only two people, right? And there's so much that needs to be done. And so the building of the network became my focus, and the building of the conservation psychology network and legacy at Antioch continues and is now growing, which is pretty exciting. So she is coming on to help mentor some of the students that are coming on to learn from us and to direct some of their research if they're interested in empathy. So if you are interested in empathy research and you want to do conservation psychology, Antioch's your jam. Connect with us, and Kath Ayoun would potentially be the person that would help you the most. So she's research faculty. My position is Director of Conservation Psychology, Strategy, and Integration, because brevity is not our thing. And essentially, what that means is that under the Conservation Psychology Institute, which is run by a colleague of mine called Abby Abrash Walton, she's amazing. And she continued the legacy after Carol left and before I came back. So that is what Abby did. And Abby was amazing at that job. And now she is overseeing the Institute, which includes Kath Ayoun, myself, a colleague of ours called Dr. Megan Gukian. So Dr. Abrash Walton, Gukian, Kath Ayoun, and then myself as kind of the folks at the helm at the Conservation Psychology Institute. We as a network, as a group, run different aspects of this, right? So Dr. Gukian really works with our master's and doctoral students, getting their research up to par to make sure that it really does contribute to our field in meaningful ways. Kath Ayun's killing it with the application game, going out there and really translating that work, specifically in empathy, back into the zoo world. And my job is to make the connection between both of them, to
Mm.
take what's being created, knowledge based stuff, out of research, new research, innovative principles coming out of conservation psychology, and connecting it to the real world problems that conservationists are having in this really unique time that we are in. uh-huh. Where yes,
My
long
drink's
term,
gone.
right, exactly, like holy crap, there are so many different things now that weren't even present, a year ago, that
No.
need to be looked at. And so this connection between humans and nature, I think if I've learned anything throughout the COVID world, is that we are inextricably linked. And if you try to do one without the other, I wish you the best of luck, but it
Yeah.
will not work long term. And so that's where my research right now is focused, is on that connection between human well-being and community well-being and conservation, and how do you connect those two to create long-term solutions.
Mm, wow. Well, as that develops, we'll have to keep having you come on to just
That's
keep us
right.
updated as your research continues and oh my gosh, yeah, cuz I want to know. I want to know what you're finding, what you're discovering, what your research is telling you, what new things those of us in the field should be doing or looking at things and analyzing stuff in a different way and how we're approaching projects and stuff. So the way that you've explained all of this is like the lens that we need to be looking at this stuff in. And so, yeah, you just need to teach us your ways. Just keep teaching us your ways.
I'm definitely not. Just me is not going to be enough, but I will tell you there is quite the strong network out there that does have the expertise that this world needs. And my I feel like my job is amplifying their voices, honestly, throughout a lot of different avenues. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk with you about it, and maybe share it with some new audiences.
Yeah, yeah. So let's switch gears a little bit
Mhm.
and let's go back to you for a second. So you've had a lot of highs and a lot of lows, I would imagine, throughout your career. What would you say has been the most difficult thing that you've had to get over or like your biggest struggle that you've had to overcome in your journey?
Yeah. Is it too glib to say the patriarchy? Like, can we?
You can say whatever you want, hun.
I
You
mean, I
can say
don't mean to be
whatever you want.
glib or too brief, but the patriarchy, misogyny, like I don't even know where to begin. But the truth is, in the world of conservation, colonialistic approaches to pretty much anything are there, are real systemic issues that quite honestly psychology can't touch, are the things that have been the biggest struggle in my
Mm,
journey. And so, for instance, the strategies that my work suggests, usually, right, we do all this science, we have these strategies, they're evidence based, we put them in a nice little package, we start to try to work with an institution to implement them. The strategies that my work suggests usually are not business as usual. The truth, if you will, that the research that we do unveils is not always what the professionals who hired me want to believe is true about what their programs are doing or if their programs are doing. For instance, nobody wants to hear that for instance, the capacity building project that they poured millions of dollars into is in fact not impacting long-term behavior change of their intended audience. Right? Like nobody wants to hear that, even if they hire you to tell them whether or not that's true. And in the past, they've been able to say, well, you can't really measure that objectively, or it takes too long to measure our long term impact, right? So, sure, that's what we're doing. But with the measurement tools that that I've created, that the field of conservation psychology has created in general, you can measure it directly in the here and now. You don't have to wait to find out if what you're doing now is going to affect long term behavior. You don't. You figure out the psychometrics to measure the hell out of it, and then you do. And so you can measure it in the here and now. And when you do, I can't promise you that what you're going to find is what you're going to like, right?
Mm.
What I can promise, however, is that knowledge is power, if you will. And the sooner that you know how your program is impacting these essential factors of sustained engagement, for instance, the quicker you can be on, like I said, an evidence based path towards more efficient conservation work. That's essentially what we're offering, right? So, when you ask me what my biggest struggle in my journey has been, I will be honest with you that it has been speaking truth to power. It's been the biggest struggle. I'm lucky enough to have amazing colleagues at AZA and Antioch and other places who help me smooth the edges, right? Like reel me in when what I'm finding makes me want to flip a damn table. Like they help me frame the truth that we're finding in a way that can be heard and acted upon by the decision makers. So I have found to like the best way to get over that struggle, if you will, is to choose the right partners to help me have that truth heard by decision makers who can actually change the systems that keep us all in the place where we're at, right? So yeah, that's kind of the struggle and how I've attempted and am finding success in working around it.
Mm. And that sounds like an ongoing one for
Oh, oh, honey. I got stories. Yeah, it's really intense out there, especially when you connect conservation work to the work of anti-racism or the work of any kind of community well-being project. Immediately, you are in unknown territory with conservation organizations. There, you really are, because that's just not in their mission, right? And but they want to do it, right? So it's holding them to their word and helping them build that integrity in what they say they want to do.
Mm. Wow. Yeah. That sounds difficult to say the least.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, because I mean, all of these subjects are touchy subjects. They
Yeah,
all are, but we have
yeah,
to push against these barriers or these standards, like norms,
yeah.
if any change is going to be done, because whatever the standard is now, whatever the norm is now, is not working.
Such a good point. And I recently was working with a huge, like really well-known conservation organization, coaching them on how to implement something called co-design, which is one of the processes that the five factors have shown to work to lead to this long-term behavior change, right? So they're implementing this. And first couple calls I get on are with these three colleagues, right? They all work at this organization, and they're all biologists, specifically like animal biologists in the conservation biologists in the field. And they live in a particular part of the United States where guns are prevalent, but not, but like rifles and large guns. And so they're specifically on the project that they were working on. We're trying to persuade people not to shoot specific wildlife that would then impact endangered species, right? That was their aim. And and it just so happened that I had lived in this part of the country for 5 years. So, and my sister owns a ranch there. Like it's a whole thing, right? So, this person comes in and is like, you know what? I hear you saying long term behavior change. I hear you saying it's important to include the humans in the decision making process. But from the perspective of said endangered species, fuck that. I don't want to do that. We don't have time for that. And like, first of all, I don't even know why I'm here. This is ridiculous. I need to go and do more conservation work, right? And so so I was grateful for her input, and at the end of the call asked her to stay on to have a conversation with me about it. And I said, "Tell me how your approach is working out for you so far. And she
Mic drop.
well,
Mic drop.
the mic drop was really me at that moment sharing with her that I had lived in the area, that she was working for many years, and I remember seeing the signs that her organization put up that said no hunting, no shooting, yada yada. And I also remember that those signs were full of bullet holes. So, is it working out for you? Is it not? And the answer is not. It's just not. I mean, not long term, not if what you're asking for is a repetitive behavior that has to happen over time. And so it's exactly to your point. It is what we need. And it's also really hard because it's very different than what we thought we needed.
It's new. I mean,
Yeah,
we're all resistant to new. I
that's right.
mean, the field of conservation, everyone was just like, "What the fuck you talking about? What
Right.
is that?" You know, like. But now it's like, okay, everybody now knows this term. So now we just need to take it to another level. It's like, okay, we all love animals. That's why we're in this field. Oh, it's not the animals, it's the people.
Right.
Oh,
Well, shit.
okay. So now we're to this point.
Right.
Okay. And so then
Yeah.
that is where now all of your work comes in. And
Yeah.
where we'll hopefully start to make some real change as more and more people get trained in
Yes.
what you know.
Yes.
So,
And please, God, I hope there's more of us because my goodness. I mean, I do have hope. We started with 2 students at Antioch when I started a year and a half ago there, and now we have 13.
wow.
And so we're just growing over time and adding experts along the way to help guide the ship because God knows me and like 2 other people just can't do it, right? So,
Mhm.
yeah, I'm hopeful. I am hopeful.
So what are you most proud of on the opposite end?
On the opposite end, well, quite honestly, I mean, I am proud of the co-design project that I'm working on with zoos across the United States right now. So the co-design process, I told you that I was working with the big conservation organization. It's the same process that I'm implementing in zoos across the United States right now. 3 specifically that I'm working with right now, and bringing on a 4th in November. And it's a 3-year project, and it comes with funding that helps support the implementation of psychological principles into conservation at the zoo in a way that helps the zoo remain relevant in their community. So it's a
Mm.
win-win-win. And I am super proud of how well that is going, how well it's being received, and how much it's growing already, which is super exciting. So that is one thing that I think I'm proud of in the moment. I would say, just in general, though, I'm most proud of the students at Antioch. I mean, every single day, I am deeply impressed by their ability to take what basically do what everybody does as they come into graduate school. You take what's already known and then you go next level. You start asking those more critical questions like, okay, Kayla, well, that's great. Meaningful ownership and effective autonomy and group efficacy might be 3 of the things that you implement to get long term behavior change. But when you do, sometimes that conflicts with community demand or this other thing. So let's look at that. Let's look at exactly why did that happen. Like, shit, man, do it. Like, I get it because I don't have time to be looking at all of the different aspects as critically as they need to be looked at. So I'm deeply impressed and deeply proud of my students right now.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And for anyone listening, I mean, we're
Mhm.
all at least trained or not trained conservationists. I would say most of the people that
Yeah.
listen to this. What advice do you have for anybody? You have a moment. What would you like to tell them?
Don't stop. I mean, I really, don't stop. I understand that right now where we're at is really a difficult place to be, especially in the midst of a resurgence of COVID, in the midst of a continued denigration of funding for conservation. Don't stop, get creative. That's what I would suggest. And so, what I mean by that, and what I explain in a webinar I've done on the co design process, the 5 principles in co design, is that right now especially, with as bleak as it is out there, especially in the funding world, you do have to get creative with funding. So things like AmeriCorps funding, which is the funder that funds a lot of the work that I do. Um, IMLS, I mean, NSF, AZL, stuff like that. Yes, very important. And what they're looking for now more than ever is the intersection of human well being and conservation. They just are. And so, if you can get creative and find a way to connect what you're doing in conservation to human well being, it's a gold mine. It's, believe me, it's a gold mine. We are finding every day more and more funding for this type of work. And especially if you can prove that it's based in science and that it's done with integrity. That is what they care the most about. And that you're working with your community to develop it, not by yourself, not in a silo. You've got partners, and that takes skills. That takes psychology skills to be able to do.
People skills, everybody.
People skills, folks.
People skills. Read your books. Yeah.
Right.
How treat people with how you want to be treated.
Exactly.
Pretty much what it comes down to. Awesome. So how can someone get a hold of you? Let's say they love everything. They're like, Kayla, I need all the
Right.
things.
Right.
What is all the ways? I know you
Sure.
already given your email, but if you want to repeat it, or if there's another way that you also prefer.
Yeah. Sure. So again, the email is kcranston@antioch.edu. So CRANSTON. The other way to get a hold or just take a look at what work we're up to is you can actually go to my website. It's kaylacranston.com and look at the research that I've done in the past and get a sense of where I'm at now. The other way, if you're really interested in the co-design process or want to become a partner, like I said, it's a growing project. So if you're at an institution that you think, might benefit from learning how to work with the community as opposed to for the community, that is something that we are working on right now, implementing psychological principles into how to do that to really reach goals that are equal parts important for conservation and for human well-being. So that's what we're doing now. If you're interested, please reach out. You can also just straight up Google 5 principles of co-design and a webinar will pop up. So that's another free resource if you're interested.
Awesome. Well, Kayla, this has been amazing. I know I learned so much, and I hope that everybody listening did. And again, I cannot wait to get this out there in the world.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Brooke. I really appreciate all of your incredibly important questions and just really opening this up to a new audience. I really do appreciate that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Wow, didn't you just learn so much from Kayla? For this week's question, I would love to ask you all this. Which of Kayla's 5 factors of sustained engagement surprised you the most? Can you think of ways to apply conservation psychology to your work? Let me know in the Rewildologist Facebook group, on Instagram @Rewildology, or at the website rewildology.com. Any of them? Can't wait to hear from you. Hey, thanks again for listening to this episode of Rewildology. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe button to never miss a future episode. Do you have a cool environmental organization, travel story, or research that you'd like to share? Let me know at rewildology.com. Until next time, friends, together we will rewild the planet.